それではパネリストの皆
So let me introduce the panelists. Chief Technical Officer, Industrial Internet Consortium, Mr. Stephen Miller. Specific Chairman of Research Council, Platform Industry 4.0, and Mr. Professor Dr. Ryan Andel. Deputy Chairman of the Board, International Data Spaces Association, and from Fraunhofer Institute, the professors, and from Fraunhofer Institutes, Professor Dr. Boris Otto. And the moderator is now the chairman of International Standard AG RRI, the University of Tokyo, the honorary professor of the University of Tokyo, Professor Dr. Fumihiko Kimura. Okay, so would you please start the panel discussions, and the professor and honorable professor, Dr. Kimura, please. Okay, I'd like to start the session. Thank you very much. Now, it's a very intensive, a lot of intensive discussions are there in the afternoon, and everyone, and I'm afraid that they're all tired, but this is the last sessions. Why don't you join us? And so this is that a lot of the presentations made, and a lot of points made in this presentation about the subject. So in order to proceed with that, the fourth industrial revolution, there's a lot of factors we have to think about. So that's why, and looking from in perspective, and we need to qualify that the challenges, and also think about it constructively, and we need to make the systematic approach. So today, including myself, the four speakers presented a lot of the specific efforts and commitments, but they're very difficult. But I'd like to review once again about the system approach from the variety of perspectives. So we need to some kind of a logical and systematic approach is needed, but at the same time we need to have some bird's eye view of all of the outline of all these issues and the pictures of this issue. So, just for your information, I'd like to show you the keywords of the discussion. Would you please show that, please? So, can you look at that? So a lot of topics came out in the presentation, and I just summarized the keywords, and so this means, for example, that the go down farther, you find out some fundamental keywords, and also going up, there's some specific challenges in the specific area, and so this represent the positioning of these challenges and issues, and so that the players, the enablers, and the requirements are all mentioned here. So in this sense, that we can see that in order to think systematically, we need to organize those issues just like this, and we'll organize it in a systematic way. But actually, it's sometimes very important and very difficult for organizing these and a lot of the different issues. And okay, so I'd like to proceed with the panel discussions and having the comments from each speaker. Would you please go to the next slide, please? So, and the couple of topics are there. These are the series of topics we need to discuss, and so that we have just summarized the topics, and I'd like to also go through this panel discussion. And we have prepared some four specific different questions, and we don't insist on each of this, but anyway, I'd like to start from the very first question. Okay, the question number one is that now, and I think we have distributed the list of questions to you, but all of these activities introduced today. What kind of approach did you take in terms of the system approach? So how do you understand the whole picture of this activity, and how do you organize and activities, and in order to make it a systematic approach. So this is a very general question, but I would like to have the comments from each speaker, please.
The way in which we approached it is primarily that we are driven by our members. What the members want is what they get. It's that simple. Because if they don't get what they want, then they won't be members anymore, and I'm out of a job, so that won't work. So it has to be driven by the members. And I would say that the majority of our members at present are technology providers of different kinds. Some, of course, the systems integrators, the GEs, the Accentures, and so on and so forth. But I'd say by far the majority is technology providers. So what is it that they want? Well, what they want to do is to create a market. It's that simple. So the way in which we did that was by working together to try to understand what on earth that meant. I mean, what is this market? What is the industrial internet? What does it mean? And as we communicated, as we talked together, as we said, well, we need an architecture. What does that mean? We need security framework. What does that mean? So on and so forth. We came to a relatively more common understanding. You'll never have exactly the same understanding. I had a chat with somebody just this afternoon that was where we went completely at cross purposes because he misunderstood a couple of words. That happens all the time. That's always going to happen. So our first step then was to establish that community. The second step was to establish a common vocabulary, a way of thinking about systems. And over time then, that turned into best practices. Because it's all very well having a framework document. We have, for example, the Industrial Internet Security Framework. I have talked about it here in Japan. And the person I was talking to, I won't tell you who, said, and what language is it written in? And I said, English. And he put his head in his hands. It was not pretty. But even English speakers and English readers are not going to read 170 pages. Sorry. I'm probably the only person on the planet who has. What they need is best practices. I'm trying to solve this one problem. What do I read to help me solve that one problem? So that was our next step. And then from there, we went to, and we didn't talk about this very much in my presentations, towards assessments and explorers. So we now are beginning to link together the framework documents together with the best practices and so-called explorer tools that allow you to say things like, well, my system has 10,000 points and they change once a second, and it's geographically distributed, and I have very little data to store, and then from that you can get suggested readings that say, well, under those circumstances, this architectural pattern might be happy. So we've reached that stage about a year ago, and then came to the conclusion that all of that doesn't matter. It's all about adoption, really. Now, of course, you're not going to get adoption unless you have all these precursors. But the next step is very clear, and that's what I talked about today, crossing the chasm. So I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I would like to continue. I would like to give my answer with 3 parts. The first part is dedicated to the holistic understanding of what we are doing in research and innovation. And for instance, this has a strong impact, for instance, on the legal system of higher education in Germany. In Germany, the responsibility of higher education is dedicated to the state governments. And most of the state governments have changed the legal system for higher education by extending the tasks for universities. Today we have research and education, and it has been extended to technology and knowledge transfer. This is quite important. Technology transfer, of course, to the enterprises, and knowledge transfer to the society. So this is a very important step forward. Then the second answer I would like to give is, I would phrase it with competing against time. All the development is so fast, and for instance, our innovation system in Germany is not as fast as we need it. For instance, if we are establishing a new call for instance, developing the asset administration shell technology of the future, including AI, for instance, then we need about 1 year for preparing a call. We need then the proposals and the review of the proposals, the evaluation of the proposals, and it needs then about 1.5 years to start with the projects. So, and typically the projects run 3 years. So in total, we are talking about 5.5 years if we want to develop a new technology. And this is too long. So we must be faster, and even in this time frame, we have to become more agile. And the third one is not to be underestimated, is the societal acceptance. And maybe we have some cultural changes here. However, if I'm following the societal acceptance discussion in Germany, then we have the issue, of course, of security, data security, system security, security of large infrastructures, and so forth is a really hot topic. But also, climate protection is very important. That means if we are introducing all this technology, is the CO2 footprint becoming lower? Is it getting lower, or is it increasing? Today we do not know. And also the change in our working system, in our working styles, and in particular in our working environment, is very important. And yes, we are discussing if we are introducing this technology, will this create more labor or less? And of course it will change, we know. However, we have to develop an approach that also satisfies the expectations of the society. So these are my 3 points.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, perhaps I can answer to the question about the relevance of a systematic approach by looking back where the IDS initiative has started and how we moved along the way. First of all, in order to apply a systematic approach, you would have to be able to determine what your system is, right? And what the boundaries of the systems are. And also, to tell you the truth, that has not been easy in the case of IDS, and it's still, to a certain extent, work in progress. And that is a little bit due to the fact, what was mentioned earlier on by Rainer Andal, that the environment of the system is constantly moving, and that has always been the case, but the frequency of changes increases. So we need to continuously reflect whether we are on the right track, and if that what we are doing is in line with expectations of the stakeholders, in particular the members. So when we started off the IDS initiative, I guess it was 2015, and the IDS Association was founded in early 2016 then. The definition of the system mainly was, well, we need to have something in place which makes sure that we as German industry do not sit on the costs of industrial data management, and some third parties yield the benefits of it. So that was basically the first version of the design specification, if you want to call it like that. Of course, that's very, very high level, and not able to. You cannot really implement on such a vague definition. So over the course of time, it turned out that there need to be something in place which we refer to as a trustworthy data sharing architecture for digital ecosystems. But this has evolved over time. How have we come to this point? And that is similar to what was mentioned by Stephen earlier on. We put the users in the first place. So we tried to identify use cases in various industries and then identified the common denominator, so to say, across the majority of these use cases. And I remember very vividly 2016, because I don't know, I think I made 25 or 30 workshops in different settings and different industries to really retrieve requirements about this vague definition of, let's say, we need to stay in control over what happens when we share our data. So we started off with a user-driven initiative, which I appreciate very much, because that does not happen that often. So users were in the first place, so manufacturing companies mainly. While we moved ahead and specified more and more how such an architecture could look like, and also got a clearer picture about, let's say, technology that would be able to implement this, the calls were intensified for, well, okay, I understand now what I want to have. I also understand as a user why it's needed, but now I need to have somebody in the market that provides me the solution as a vendor. And by that time, it was, I believe, 2017 or so, more and more software vendors and integrators joined the association, which was by that time, and still is, was very important, because it allowed us to transform these user requirements into something which is technologically feasible, and which can then also be consumed as a service or as a product in the market. In the next stage, we realized that if we are moving ahead towards a distributed, trustworthy data sharing architecture, which is based on the idea that there is no central data storage in the middle. Of course, the design principle of coming up with something which is distributed and decentralized is nice, but it's of course the more complex architecture design compared to a central architecture. And of course, it requires certain components, certain services in the middle that make sure, or that ensure that the different distributed elements understand each other and that they can be interoperable. And that moved then ahead towards a discussion, well, we need to see these shared components or these shared services, and I'd like to outline some of them. For example, it comprises a certain certification process to make sure that only IDS, or only where what is IDS certified, basically contains IDS. It also comprises the provisioning and maintenance of digital certificates to ensure certain trust levels. It also comprises the establishment and the operation of a basic broker service. So those kind of shared basic services need to be in place in order to make this ecosystem come to life. And the discussion at present in Germany and also in other parts of the world, I believe, is, okay, if this is an infrastructure similar to the industrial infrastructure of railway systems, of, let's say, electricity networks, of motorways, for example, that we have discussed as infrastructure mainly in the last century, in the digital age, of course, we need to discuss how such a digital infrastructure looks like, which ensures data sovereignty, and also discuss questions like, well, who is providing it, who is responsible for it, who is paying for it, and that is an interesting discussion which is currently ongoing. So to wrap up and to summarize a little bit, the challenge that we all share, I believe, is to be able to clearly specify and define or determine the system that is needed and also the boundaries of the system, to decompose it into elements, perspectives, then you can work on and can basically achieve reasonable results in a reasonable amount of time. And in order to achieve that, what is requirement is in the first place common and shared, consistent terminology, which also we discussed earlier on, which is not easy to achieve. And in the second stage, we would like to also use architectural viewpoints to identify, let's say, patterns of the IDS architecture to be used in a certain specific application scenarios, to stick with this word. So it is a complex task at hand, but it's, to be honest, also from a research perspective, also lots of fun, to say that.
May I add a comment, please?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting that the three of us have answered the question very differently. Professor Otto has essentially argued around technology and infrastructure. Professor Andal talked more about societal and environmental issues. My perspective was primarily from the point of view of our consortium and advancing that particular marketplace. What we haven't talked about is the perspective of an individual company. How does an individual company have a systematic approach to digital transformation and to deploying these kinds of technologies in their factories, their chemical plants, their roads, etc., etc. And I think that's an important thing to discuss, perhaps not necessarily in this audience, but those companies need to have a plan for market awareness, identifying opportunities, characterizing them in some way so that they can determine whether there's any value, building up a portfolio, selecting first projects, getting learnings back into a center of excellence, and then deploying those learnings on the next project, and then reiterating over and over and over. And also, my final point on this, because I know you have another question here, you need to think about organizational change. Large industrial companies have plants on the average of 19 years old, and my phone is updating, it's doing something right now, I can feel it. You don't update software, you don't update hardware in a factory or a chemical plant on that scale. You have compliance and safety and so on and so forth. But that also applies at the level of the organization. Large companies are used to making large bets. Think about Airbus and the A380. That started 20 years ago. They still haven't made a profit, right? So they're not going to abandon that tomorrow. They're going to be twisting Emirates' arms to be able to get more airplanes sold and so on and so forth. But in this market, the industrial internet market, they have to fail quickly. They have to move quickly, build something. If it works, exploit it, make it bigger. If it fails, kill it now. And that is just not at all the way in which the boards of, let's say, Daimler or Huawei or Toyota think about these problems. And that's a very fundamental point.
Perhaps one comment that just comes to my mind when Stephen, when you outlined to take the view of the individual enterprise, I think that is something that we also share both in Japan and Germany. We did a survey about the readiness of the companies to, let's say, participate in such digital ecosystems. And what we usually do is we come up, let's say, with a maturity model, which allows you to assess your maturity in terms of data readiness on a level starting from 0, which basically is an analogous company, up to 5, which basically is an orchestrator of a digital ecosystem. And thanks to a grant from the Ministry for Economic Affairs, we did a representative survey in Germany, which basically found that 80% would consider themselves on the first 2 maturity levels. 80%. I could not believe it, which basically says it's analogous on level 0, right? And that the reason for that was that, let's say, in the panel of respondents, there were, I guess, more than 75% what you consider smaller and really small, medium-sized companies with less than 50 employees. And in that group, half of the respondents have less than 10 employees. And now you can say, well, okay, obviously we need to enable these kind of companies, because they are the backbone of the national economy in Germany, because those are, let's say, the typical Mittelstand. And the other thing is, besides enablement, we need to make sure that these people, because they are driven by individuals, these little companies, do not behave in the same way as a private person when they share their data, meaning they do not care at all, right? So there is a lot of enablement education needed in order to really come up to a functioning and effective digital ecosystems.
I'm very sorry, I completely disagree. It's even worse. And what we found out is that throughout all branches, we identified what we call shadow IT. That means even in small and medium-sized enterprises, the employees use IT. Yes, this one. WhatsApp, for instance. And there is a lot of communication between the colleagues. The problem is that management doesn't know. And of course, based on that, it's not organized. And coming back to Professor Kimura's question, it is not a systematic approach. No, it's how do you call it? Ad hoc. It's an ad hoc approach. And it's also dangerous because nobody cares about data security. Nobody cares about sovereignty. Nobody cares about attacks. And for an enterprise, this could be really dangerous. So I'm not sure about the situation here in Japan, but if you are from a company, please have a look at the shadow IT.
Another thing there, of course, is that all of the items that we have just mentioned, sovereignty, governance, and so on and so forth, cost money. And a 10-person company has to identify someone who's going to actually make that happen. Yesterday, I received an email from a large company, as it happens, my banker, from his private account, saying, "I'm sorry, I forgot to make that trade yesterday. I didn't get confirmation from you. I need a verbal confirmation. So just send me an email to my business account that says, thanks for the call, glad we confirmed that sale." And then off we went and did what we needed to do. I'm happy, actually, because it got done. I didn't have to coordinate time zones and all that nonsense. But you can see how complex this can get and how quickly.
Thank you very much. Now, there are a lot of the subjects and the topics comes out in the comments. Thank you very much. I need to organize that the streamline the discussion. But compared to Japan, there are a lot of difference with the U.S. and the Germany, for example. And now you explained about your historical activities, but now there's not just a top-down. You do not take the top-down approach, but it seems like the more about a architecture and the data organized within the bottom-up rather approach. And but I think that's here in Japan, it's very difficult to promote the bottom-up type of approach. But in Germany, that you have the skilled resource and a lot of good resources. We have the skilled and expertise of doing that in the bottom-up approach. That you have the resource in Germany.
Yeah, that's. I mean, that's a very good observation. I think one of the specifics in Germany to approach these kind of issues, which also applies to the International Data Space Association, is that we pretty much rely on consensus building processes. So we try to engage and involve as much stakeholders as possible. In particular, in the IDS initiative, we try to engage with as many user domains as possible. we also try to cover and address not only technological but also business perspectives. But of course, when aligning the activities with the broader environment, in particular the platform industry 4.0, we of course are discussing ethical issues as well. And I believe that as everything in life, this approach to have some bottom-up process in place has pros and cons, right? The advantages is that it's basically driven by, well, to a certain extent, it's even a grassroots initiative, which is driven by the individuals that are motivated to contribute to the process. But on the other hand, it of course takes longer, right? And it was mentioned a couple of times that time to market with such a standard for an architecture is important. It is important to convey the message, to educate sooner than later. And this is something that is easier if you would follow a top-down approach, of course. However, I believe that also compared, not in contrast, but compared to developments in the US, but also in other parts of Asia, like in China, this consensus-driven bottom-up process and approach is very typical for Germany and Europe, because it might take longer, but in the end, it is all the challenges, open issues have been on the table, so to say, before the things are adopted. So in terms of the other thing that you mentioned, in terms of skills needed, well, that is also a challenge, because the things are moving in different, well, velocities or speeds, right? In these consensus building processes, you have, let's say, usually a tiny little group of people who have been in charge or involved from the very beginning. But then you have, let's say, like in an onion model, other people that come in and drop out again. So you have lots of resources to be spent to make sure that everybody is on a similar stage of knowledge in this process, which is sometimes also not easy to achieve. So therefore, I think this is something which is, well, to a certain extent, a bit special to Germany or Europe and as a whole. But as I said, it has pros and cons. As I said, the cons are it's slower. One has to really say that. But it's based on a consensual, a mutual understanding of what has to be done in the end. And it might be, perhaps as a last comment, more sustainable in the end.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
マルさんの方で ISC では非常に丁寧な
Mr. Miller,
産業コンソーシアとして
in your
産業界の
Industrial Internet Consortium, you've been doing very fine-tuned management. Looking at our activities in Japan, do you have any observations or comments on how we could run our organization well?
Well, that's an organizational question, I think. And again, the top-down, bottom-up question is important here, because RRI receives funding from the government and therefore direction from the government, and therefore it's kind of top-down. But on the other hand, governments can say what they like. It doesn't mean to say the populace has to, well, sorry, I forgot China. Don't necessarily have to follow. The way in which we have done it is always by trying to bring people along and to bring people together, and also to break things apart so that different initiatives can flower and then be coalesced. I'll give you just one example that I hope might be helpful, and that is that in January we joined forces with the Open Fog Consortium. Fog and Edge are extremely similar in terms of technology and intent. You can look at it one way and call it fog, look at it another, call it edge, but basically we're talking about the same thing. We joined forces But to make that happen, we had to make a decision about what term to use in the future. That answer was given to us by Google. 74 million hits for edge, 5.6 for fog, so that answered that question. But we also had to cater to the constituencies. So the fog people are fogging and the edge people are edging, and everybody's having lots of fun. But we also put together a paper that said, basically, look, the term is edge, don't worry about the differences. All that's doing is causing market confusion. And that paper, I hope, helped with the market. It's only 8 pages. Help people understand. Don't worry about it. It's just different organizations trying to put their own stamp on this technology. But it also set the direction for how we wanted the two groups to work. So neither of them are finished, but they will eventually. And then there will be another reconciliation process. And that's continuous. It always goes that way. You can't do bottom-up only. You have to do bottom-up and then take a look from the top down and say, does that make sense? Same thing with top-down. You start going, well, I want to go that way. Okay, but there's a great big wall here. I have to go bottom-up and go around it. Now, the same thing with trying to synchronize activities within the organization. So in respect to your specific question of what can RRI do, I think to be effective in getting members to work together, I think it's important that you keep that perspective of letting them do what they want to do and need to do, and then finding ways to reconcile things. And do that repeatedly, over and over and over.
Perhaps one comment from my side on that question, which basically also relates to the necessity, I would really call it, to collaborate, because we mentioned it a couple of times. There is a time pressure on all of us. So we need definitely to make sure not to reinvent the wheel, right? So we should rather reuse what's out there, what fits to the own purpose. And therefore, I think alignment between different initiatives like RRI, or Platform Industry 4.0, or Gaia, or IDS, is important in order basically to, well, to share the burden and share the work to a certain extent, right? And make sure that, let's say, we try to agree on certain standards which need to be reinvented. And I think this is something that needs to be coordinated, and, well, an event like this is really contributing to this goal.
I very much agree. IIC is particularly concerned with trying to bring together the several initiatives. I saw one of the presentations talking about listing use cases and looking for commonalities. We're doing that kind of thing. It would be good to be working together. But there's a very important personal and cultural aspect to that. People need to be in control. You can't just say, well, you do that. People volunteer their time in organizations like ours. You can't tell them what to do. They have to do what interests them. And so you have to keep going back and forth, trying to get people to talk, keep going around, keep making sure that things are still heading that way, even though some people are over here and some people are over there. And the key trick I've learned for that is to identify areas of agreement before areas of disagreement. Right? So if I take my edge fog example, our very first meeting with them was a technical meeting after we'd actually done the deed. It was a complete disaster. They were all, well, this is edge. Oh, no, it isn't. That's fog. And this just went on. Completely silly. Because all it does is divide people into camps and make it so they have to win, irrespective of the effect on the market, the effect on themselves even, the effect on their companies. So let's work first to identify what we agree on. And when we do that, we begin to develop a common vocabulary. We begin to understand each other. And most of all, we begin to trust each other, because this really is a personal thing, right? If I get some message from you, go, well, that was a stupid idea, and it should be this, and it should be that, I'm not your best friend for a few days. Yeah? So work on areas of agreement.
Thank you. The systematic approach is quite complex. Being able to reuse what already exists and breaking the problem into smaller parts is a basic approach. I think we all have an understanding about this, but actually implementing it is easier said than done. I understand that many of you have struggled with that. In Germany, it seems the education system and the society has been successful to promote Industry 4.0. How do you, in Germany, how do you get buy-in of society?
In Germany, we are working right now on several levels for getting the technology to the various parts of the society, I should say. Of course, a main target are the enterprises, and here the very important issue is not to exclude the small and medium-sized enterprises. This is very important. And then, of course, another target is what's very interesting, the trade unions, because the trade unions in Germany have a responsibility in also deciding, for instance, about working styles and working organizations and so forth. And then what is very important to us, we don't have too much problems with getting the technology into higher education. We have some challenges to meet in changing, reshaping our dual education system on the business level. And here we are putting a lot of effort in getting the education in the dual system, I would say, redefined. Because in many, in many parts of this dual education system, we don't have the new approaches which we are now, which you have on your list. Be it new business models, be it IoT, be it IT security, they don't learn anything about it. And here, a very big task is to redefine our dual education system. And of course, with respect to the society, this is also very important. Our Minister for Education and Research has just given the statement that all researchers in future should more communicate with the society. Not only produce excellent research results, but talk about it, convince the society to accept these results, and explain to the society why these results are good for the society. And so, as I mentioned before, we are entering into a new decade where we have a significant change with respect to our research strategies.
Perhaps a comment on that. I think that is something which Germany can take from the Japanese way to address the issue, because I like the idea of talking about society 5.0, I think it's phrased. So in general, looking at it from the societal perspective. Why? Because, and that was pretty nicely also outlined in the presentation from the gentleman from the Toyota Research Institute. In the end, the driver of innovation comes from the consumer world in many cases, right? And I believe that that is true because we see in the B2B and industrial domain that we move from mechanical over electrical engineering towards embedded systems engineering to a new, let's say, paradigm, which Rainer Andel also outlined. It's basically the web paradigm, right? I mean, web and consumer technologies are now entering the manufacturing environments and in industrial companies. And I believe it is a good idea to really think of, let's say, the society as a whole as a starting point, because that includes what all of us as individuals, as part of the society, experience in using innovative technologies. And that would basically also lead to much higher adoption and also would, let's say, address fears that many people carry with them when it comes to digitalization. That is something that I like very much. The discussion in Germany, in my personal opinion, is often, let's say, too technology-driven, too industrial-driven, which basically prevents, in my point of view, faster, easier, and better understood adoption.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, and we have just the topics diversified so much, and first we try to focus on the systematic approach, because now the issue is very complicated, so that how we should address these complicated issues, then here comes the importance of the systematic approach. But anyway, and we have a lot of good comments, but last of all, and I'd like to have a comment from each of the speaker, and including your presentations, and in order to deal with these complicated issues, and system thinking, system approach, whatever we might call it, is an academic or in a pragmatic way. There will be a lot of definition about it, but anyway, and how do you think that's, and how we should use that system approach and in actual and in a realistic way in a pragmatic world?
Thank you. I don't know whether you used this word or whether the translator did, but at one point we said system approach, and then the next clause was system thinking. Perhaps in Japanese it's the same thing, but it definitely is not in English. Similarly, in German, Sicherheit means safety and what I would call security, and that's a problem. But the point I want to make here is that a systematic or system approach is one thing. It's you are trying to do something, you have a way of doing it, you examine it. It's all the kind of capability, maturity model stuff, and that makes sense. What we don't have enough of is system thinking, and that is thinking about what effect our actions have. I'll give you the classic example, the so-called drug war. What happens when you prohibit drugs? Well, people are going to take drugs anyway, so they're going to find a supplier. That supplier is illegal. What are they going to do? They're going to build cartels. What is the user going to do? They're going to steal to fund their havoc because the prices are high. People don't think about that. They don't say, well, what is the result of that law? How does it change society? So if we go back to the prior question, thinking about education and so on, our education system, at least the education system in the US and the UK, the ones I know the best, are ossified. They are in the 18th century. Why do children have August and September off? Because they used to help on the harvest. Why is it that we have closed book examinations when we have Google? It makes no sense, right? We need to be thinking in a system way. What happens when I change this? How does it change the society? I think here we need to engage science fiction writers, because that's their big skill, right? Take some idea, change one thing. What if you could live forever with organ transplants? What would happen? Death penalty for running a red light. Easy. You just need to think it through. We're not doing that.
Yes. First, I agree. Second, I think what is also very important is that we have to increase our communication, and we should also increase the establishment of communities. My experience in establishing the platforms is that many people, many experts from completely different disciplines joined together, and of course they discussed together and they came up with solutions which were quite sustainable. And I think we have to tear down the barriers between the various disciplines, between the various branches, between the various groups in the society. And by establishing such communities, I think this would be very, very important, and is also a part of the systems thinking.
ありがとうございます。
Okay, thank you very much.
Enough?
Yeah.
That's not-
Perhaps two thoughts on this. I also believe that proliferation of system thinking is what is needed. As you said, I mean, usually we decompose a complex architecture into its parts and then let the work be done in groups. What is usually missing in these times is, let's say, a common frame of reference, a common shared mental model about, let's say, the whole system and its implications. And that is something that we need to foster and drive forward. The other thing is, I think, besides communication, when we have such a frame of reference, what we need to foster also is collaboration. Because, I mean, where does good design happen? It does not happen if I am sitting at my desk in my office and look into this computer screen. And the good ideas come to the table when you interact with others, in particular if you have diverse teams. And that is something that I'd like to emphasize, want to see emphasized in the future much more.
どうもありがとうございます。
Okay, thank you very much. Now, and we're already the time's up. And initially, and I would just actual scenario of the panel have changed since I've just expected. But anyway, and they introduce a lot of activities from each of the speaker, and but now that get all the discussion all the more interesting. Thank you very much. And there's no any summary of this discussion, but anyway, and I think there's no all these informations and the panelists will be informative for all of you. That's all. Thank you very much. Thank you.